From oil and gas to lithium and rare earth elements, the story of the modern world has often been shaped by competition over natural resources. But in many parts of the world today, it's not oil or gold that drives tension. It's something far more basic: water. From disputes along the Nile and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to tensions over the Indus and the Mekong, water access has become one of the defining geopolitical challenges of our time. In the 21st century, water is arguably our most critical resource. The questions we face are profound. Will nations be able to manage their shared water resources in the spirit of cooperation? Will scarcity and climate change push societies towards conflict? Or are there innovative ways to mitigate these challenges before they become a crisis? I'm Djene, and you're listening to Talking History. To help us think through these pressing issues, we're joined by Dr. Sara Mitchell, a professor of political science at Iowa University. Dr. Mitchell is one of the foremost experts on international conflict and cooperation, particularly when it comes to shared natural resources. Her research explores how geography, institutions, and diplomacy shape the ways that states interact over borders, rivers, and territorial disputes. Dr. Mitchell, welcome to Talking History.
Thank you for having me.
So, Dr. Mitchell, you've studied how countries share and fight over rivers around the world. Some people assume as water gets scarcer in different parts of the world, wars over water are inevitable. But your research suggests other possibilities.
Yes, we do find that in regions that have high water scarcity, like the Middle East, there are more diplomatic conflicts over shared river basins. There's more militarized conflict over those disputes. So water scarcity certainly is a risk factor for countries having conflicts in river basins. But as Aaron Wolf, a geography professor, shows in his work, there's way more cooperation than conflict over rivers. So he catalogs in his project something like 8,000 cooperative agreements that have been signed between countries, over their rivers. There are also hundreds of river basin organizations around the world that are a form of cooperation. But we find some other factors, though, that make conflict more likely the outcome in those cases. So first of all, geography plays a role. Longer rivers are more likely to be contested. That makes sense. Like longer territorial borders also more likely to be contested. Democracies, though, are less likely to have conflicts over rivers if their neighbors are also democracies. So that's a sort of path to peace if you have a region with a lot of democratic states like Western Europe. We also find that relative power is important. And so there's an idea in the water literature that if you have what's called a hydrohegemon, a state that's more powerful than other states in that basin, you're more likely to get cooperation because essentially the powerful state can negotiate favorable outcomes. So if you think about India on the Ganges or the United States on the Rio Grande, those are cases where there have been agreements that the powerful state has helped usher in. But there's a downside, as we're seeing in the Ganges, right? Because the agreement that India signed with Bangladesh, for example, is set to expire in 2026. And India is now pushing for revision on that would give them more water, essentially. And Bangladesh has really been complaining about that. So sometimes, even though we can get more treaties with hydrohegemony, it could also create conflict, or the weaker state could sort of lose out in those negotiations.
So just kind of to follow up on that then, scarcity of water doesn't necessarily mean conflict. There's going to be a lot of institutional factors, geopolitical factors that are also going to play into whether conflicts over water resources in different parts of the world are going to explode in conflict. So it's not simply a matter of water resources are drying up, so inevitably conflict's going to erupt.
I think it's that scarcity of water does increase conflict risks, but there are lots of other factors, like you said, like geography, relative power, regime type, whether the countries trade with each other, what other kind of cultural similarities they might have. So there's lots of things that could predict what, sort of how they would negotiate those issues.
Right. So in recent years, of course, we are hearing a lot more about droughts, disappearing rivers, and other environmental changes that, could have a problematic effect. I know from the areas I study in the Middle East, you have big conflicts between Turkey and Syria and Iraq over the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and, compounding that, you've had droughts, and, that makes water even more precious as a resource for these countries. So based on your research, can we predict where water disputes are likely to flare up before they turn violent? So is there a mechanism in your work which allows you to almost sort of predict where the real risks are? So, for example, there could be a part of the world where, yes, there's a water shortage, but let's say in Western Europe, but we're not particularly worried about a war breaking out in Western Europe because they have institutional mechanisms to deal with that. Does your research, for example, find out what the kind of warning signs are for those conflicts, and what kind of warning signs are, let's say, policymakers or even people on the ground needing to watch for?
Well, I think there was an idea in the 1980s that we were going to witness a lot of water wars. And certainly when people thought about Israel, for example, taking the headwaters of the Litani River in the Six-Day War, like this was a strategic move, right, to secure water rights. And I think there was an expectation that we were going to see more of this. But as I just mentioned, when people started cataloging conflict and cooperation, there was just a lot more cooperation over rivers. In my project called the Issue Correlates of War project with Paul Hensel, we code conflicts over different diplomatic issues like land border disputes, maritime disputes, river disputes, or issues involving ethnic groups in two countries, say. And what we find, for example, is that rivers are the least militarized issue of those four issues. So about close to half of all land borders have led to some kind of militarized conflict. About a third of maritime disputes involve military clashes, but only 1 in 10 river conflicts involve militarized conflict. And a lot of the cases in our data are the ones that you just mentioned. So there has been several militarized disputes in the Tigris Euphrates, in the Jordan Basin. So the Middle East really is a kind of hub of where we see a lot of that conflict. I think the other thing that's interesting is that when we look for water conflict, a lot of it is happening inside the state rather than between countries. So the Syrian civil war, I think, is a good example where you had dams that were built by Turkey upstream, which reduced water flow downstream in the basin, but then when combined with a really severe drought, led to a massive displacement of people from the area around the basin. And political scientists have shown that the people that were displaced out of those areas, right, went to other cities in Syria, and in those places where nighttime lights essentially increased because more people were there, we saw more protests in those areas. And so, if water gets connected to which groups have access to water, like with Israelis and Palestinians, if people get displaced because of droughts or climate shocks, and if you're a downstream state like Syria, you're more at risk for having these kind of conflicts. And so I find that I look at, for example, 10 different types of political violence, armed conflict measures, and river conflicts between countries increase the likelihood of all 10 of those. And so it's making countries' internal security more threatened, essentially, than necessarily seeing water wars between countries.
So the risk of conflict over water is, in the 80s you mentioned, people were predicting these wars between different countries over water resources. But the data over the last, let's say, 40 years has painted a slightly different picture. Not that water resource conflicts don't exist, but they tend to be within countries. So, a country might dam a particular river, which reduces those resources in the neighboring country, which then, has a kind of domino effect within that country. So it's almost as if, people were looking for the interstate conflict aspect of this, but actually the reality was that it made civil wars perhaps more likely.
Yes. And I think It is interesting, though. In more recent work, we've looked at climate shocks. So we look at, do countries have bigger volatility, for example, in their temperatures or their precipitation? Like you have really dry months and really wet months. And so those, you swing, we feel this, right, in the Midwest. We're swinging back and forth between higher temperatures and lower temperatures and lots of rain and no rain. And what we find actually in that project is that interstate conflict is increasing between countries that are having these climate shocks. And so maybe today water is acting more as a risk factor for conflict between countries because countries' water supplies are just, they're more volatile. And in fact, the Bangladesh example I was talking about, India is trying to revise that because climate change has altered the amount of water flow that they can depend on. And so it's creating, this volatility in water flow, which is also being created by volatility in rainfall, right? It is having this ripple down effect. And so I do think we might see more interstate conflicts in the future, especially if climate change is acting as a trigger for some of those.
You mentioned India and Bangladesh. Now, I would assume you also talked about the sort of importance of water hegemons. In a conflict between India and Bangladesh, I can't really imagine Bangladesh being particularly successful given the sort of military balance of power in South Asia. Bangladesh is a small country compared to India. Are there other parts of the world where you have a kind of situation where there are two sort of more or less equal or similarly balanced powers that might go to war over water resources, where you think there's a high likelihood of such interstate conflicts taking place?
Well, we actually find that if the riparian states are equal in power, they're more likely to sign cooperative agreements. And so if you think about the Orange River, for example, which involves countries like Botswana, South Africa, Lesotho, that particular agreement is often shown as one of the most successful multilateral river agreements. And if you look at the sort of GDP per capita of those countries, there's some disparity, but it's not as big as if you looked at, say, the Nile River Basin, where Egypt clearly has more military and economic power than some of its neighbors like Ethiopia and Sudan, or U.S. versus Mexico is much bigger disparity. So interestingly, where you have sort of you would think as a conflict scholar that power parity is dangerous because these countries think that if I go to war with you, I have a chance of winning. But at least in terms of getting agreements, that ability to have relatively equal power also creates better bargains. And so even though India can sign agreements with Bangladesh or other states on the Ganges, those agreements are not as successful because essentially they're using their power asymmetry to
India can
to their advantage.
It's like I'm changing the deal. Pray I don't change it anymore.
Yes.
Like this kind of situation. Well, you actually mentioned here Egypt and Ethiopia, and that's people who follow the news may have heard in recent years. I think it's the Blue Nile Dam is being constructed by Ethiopia, and obviously that's a big issue for Egypt. What's going on with that conflict? Because that's been often cited, at least in recent years, as like a really potential hotspot for water war conflicts.
Yeah, I think some projections are that the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or the GERD, could affect as much as 85% of Egypt's agricultural areas. And so, in other words, like the water loss could be that significant. And we've already seen in Egypt sort of local protests by people living in water-affected areas. Of course, this also happened in Syria, where when farmers started losing access to water, they started drilling illegally for wells, essentially, and you saw the same thing in parts of Egypt. And so this is why for many years Egypt has been threatening Ethiopia and Sudan, with potential military intervention. So essentially, like, if you guys cut our water off, we're going to defend ourselves. And it hasn't come to that, but there's also, if you look at projections of lots of large cities in the world that could be running out of water, this could include like London, Sao Paulo, but Cairo is on this list of really large mega cities that could potentially lose, access to fresh water just because there's too much demand on the system. So you get this. Egypt is a classic case of population growth that's very rapid, right? And so you get a higher need for agricultural land in those places, which increases water demand. But then you also get more water need in the cities when people are moving to those urban areas. And so Egypt, I think, is a sort of classic case of a country that's growing really quickly. It's downstream in the Nile, so it's actually, even though it's more powerful, it's susceptible to what the upstream neighbors are doing. And and these increasing water demands are going to put the country. I mean, I think if I was looking at a hot spot in the future, I might keep my eye on that one.
Well, one of the topics you've written about is how the way treaties are designed, and more specifically how they handle disputes and monitoring and enforcement, can determine whether cooperation, how successful cooperation can be. What kind of things, and you've already perhaps mentioned a few of these, such as sort of the relative parity of powers, but what kind of things make water treaties work? What are the real world examples where countries have built strong partnerships, for example, around project of shared management of water resources?
Yeah, so I mentioned if the negotiating countries are kind of equal in capabilities, you get more agreements. It's also the case if they have more trade, if they're both democratic, if they have a history, a sort of shared language and cultural ties, you can get more agreements. In terms of the design of the agreements, we find that enforcement mechanisms are really effective at promoting cooperation or reducing militarized conflict. And so this would be like a treaty that says if either side violates it, they have to compensate the other side financially. And so you've seen U.S. and Canada have used those kind of provisions. Italy and France, in one of their agreement, has this kind of basically punishment for defecting on the agreement that's monetary. But the thing is, only I think it's less than 20% of all river treaties include these kind of enforcement provisions. So
who does the enforcing in these cases?
Well, it's basically the countries. All international relations is self-enforcing, right? So there, because there is no global policeman, for any institution that countries join, they have to themselves decide to comply with whatever treaty or institution that they sign. Now, there are some institutions that have more teeth in terms of sanctioning countries. So you can think about the International Monetary Fund, for example, and its bailout packages has specific mechanisms by which it could sort of punish the country getting these loans. But in river treaties, we don't really have that many mechanisms for, like the parties have to agree to share information about the river basin. They have to monitor each other's behavior. They have to, commit to whatever water sharing agreement they have.
So it's not like, let's say, maritime law where you have kind of a more articulated sort of form of international court system. It's very much a bilateral thing between countries that they agree to abide by.
Yes, and the Law of the Sea Convention is perhaps the most successful multilateral institution ever created. It has a third of the treaty deals with dispute settlement between countries. It articulates exactly rights for territorial sea limits, exclusive economic zones. And so it's easier. Now countries still have maritime disputes because there's still disagreement about where can I draw my baseline from, or is that a rock or not, or an island?
Yeah.
But river, there's only one UN convention that was signed. It was a watercourse convention in 1997, I think. And that was the only sort of international agreement related to river basins. Everything else has been at the regional level. And so there's been a lot of cooperation, but it's much more like region by region, creating their own institutions, essentially.
Is there, with the growing scarcity of water, is there any impetus, for example, to expand UN mechanisms to resolve water disputes, or does it look like the kind of existing status quo in the management of rivers is going to stay in place, where you have these regional agreements or these bilateral agreements between countries? Is there any kind of shift on the ground there, or are we dealing with just this system kind of works, so why change something that's not broken?
Yeah, the UN, they do have some agreements that promote like sustainable uses of resources. They've tried to put money into infrastructure for countries that have a lot of disasters. So, for example, in Peru, the UN provided money because there's a lot of flooding in Peru, and so trying to build up the infrastructure, that so that the size and scope of those floods gets reduced. So yeah, I'm not saying the UN isn't active. The UN also, the World Bank has provided a lot of money for water infrastructure, like the building of dams. But the thing is, I'm saying there's no global institution like the UN Law of the Sea Convention, which is, all countries belong to it except the United States, and well, there's a couple others that don't belong, but almost everybody participates. It's very successful, and rivers, while very cooperative on average, there's just much more variation across river basins in terms of the sort of whether they have an agreement in place and how extensive it is.
Obviously, one of the causes of the dispute is the construction of dams. And dams, for many developing countries, are very critical pieces of infrastructure, especially in terms of electrification, to make the cost of energy cheaper. So, how can countries, especially developing countries, balance the need for electricity and development with questions of fairness, questions of geopolitical questions. A country like Ethiopia obviously, has had a long history of internal conflict and authoritarianism and, economic underdevelopment. So, the dams that they're constructing on the Upper Nile are, extremely important to the future of that country. But of course, it kind of creates this zero-sum game where it seems at least that Ethiopia is going to build these dams and it's going to benefit Ethiopia, and Egypt's going to lose either way. So, how do you balance those kind of things? How does the international community even look at these kind of issues? Because obviously, if we look at a country like Egypt and Ethiopia, if they do go to war, if there is a conflict, that's going to have ripple effects and knock-on effects, across the world. We already saw, for example, the Syrian civil war, which we can link to water conflict, led to a wave of refugees, which led to the destabilization of the European political systems, has led to, austerity, growing sort of anti-migrant feeling. There's all these kind of second and third order, issues that emanate from them that you might not think about most immediately. And obviously, I just can't imagine what would happen if you end up with a huge wave of refugees coming from Egypt, flowing into countries like Greece and Italy, and the militarization of the Mediterranean, which we're already beginning to see. How do we balance these kind of needs? Because at the same time, developing these countries, developing a country like Ethiopia, building hydroelectric dams, that's a way to allow people to have livelihoods in their country so that they don't feel the need to move to Europe or move to the United States. So how does the international community approach this? How do we balance these kind of issues? Because on the surface, it seems like a bilateral dispute or a regional dispute, but obviously, I think we'll see a lot of knock-on effects that mean that a lot of different groups outside of a particular region may have an interest in the resolution of these conflicts.
Yeah, certainly, and in terms of hydroelectric dams, some of the successful cases are sort of two countries on a river agreeing to build the dam together. So like Brazil and Paraguay on the Parana River is an example where they both contributed to building a hydroelectric dam. They share the electricity from that dam. You could also point to the Mekong River Basin where you have the same thing. So you have countries that are, like Thailand, that is funding the building of dams in Myanmar and Laos, and you have China, which is funding the building of dams. Building its own dams in the upper Mekong, but also funding dams elsewhere. This all sounds good, and actually these countries that build these dams use the excess electricity to sell to other states. So they're making money off of this. The problem is, of course, that this is affecting the whole ecosystem of the Mekong. So it's disrupting migratory fish stocks downstream. It's creating problems with the sediment moving downstream, which is then affecting the agricultural area of the lower Mekong. And so, even though, I think maybe a theme here is fragmented governance. If you've got 6 countries in a basin and 2 of them agree to do something like build a dam, this can create negative externalities for other states in the basin. So I think countries need to think about if they're doing these kind of by fragmented agreements or bilateral agreements, how are those going to affect other states, and thinking more broadly. In terms of the bigger issues, I mean, on the one hand, there's opportunities for cooperation. So we find in looking at oil and gas, for example, if an upstream state has hydroelectric dams and this affects a downstream state's access to water in the agricultural season, the downstream state could agree to sell oil and gas to the upstream state so that they will release more water. And this is something we've seen in the Aral Sea rivers like the Sirdarya and the Amu Darya, where the downstream states essentially sell more gas and oil to the upstream states during the growing season. This is partly because during the Soviet era, the Soviets mandated that they had this like oil for water trade. And we tested this across all countries, all regions for several decades, and we found that pattern actually repeats itself all over the world. So if a downstream state has fossil fuel resources, it can actually use those to trade to an upstream state that doesn't. And so you can get these kind of cooperative trades that could be mutually beneficial. You're talking about something much bigger, which is if we have these really big sort of forced migration or climate moving a lot of people, creating conflict, moving people out of those conflict zones into other regions, that's a much bigger problem. And the UN didn't even designate climate as a reason for refugee status until something like 2007. So for a long time, people were getting displaced by disasters and other climate-related things, but the UN wasn't really classifying refugees that way. And so I think today, right, that's changed a lot in the last 15 or so years. But the projections for how many people are going to be displaced by these future events is extremely large. And as sea levels rise, people are going to get displaced from coastal areas. As the ocean warms, there's going to be more and more severe storms. You can think about there was a huge cyclone that hit Oman in 2021 that was being generated off of this like warming sea area. And so places that historically weren't getting slammed by cyclones, right, are potentially going to be. And I think the future people, us, we need to figure out ways to deal with these kind of climate events and shocks, because if we ignore them, maybe that's at our peril that we ignore them.
Dr. Mitchell, thank you so much for your time joining us here on Talking History.
Thank you.
I'm Djene Badgelan. You've been listening to Talking History, a joint KSMU Radio and Missouri State University Department of History production. You can catch Talking History on the first Thursday of every month after the midday news, or as a podcast available at ksmu.org or wherever you get your podcasts.